The first thing you need to know is that the forgotten ward was never meant to be remembered. For 100 years it functioned in silence, sealed off, hidden behind heavy doors, its patients reduced to whispers and its records burned before they could ever reach the public eye. But fragments survive, enough to paint a picture so grotesque, so deliberately buried, that even speaking of it now feels like prying open a coffin. Imagine walking through a hospital corridor, the lights flickering, the walls thick with mildew, when suddenly you come upon a door that isn't on any map. Behind it lies a century of human misery, experiments in control, manipulation, and madness that most of history has quietly agreed to erase. This is not a story about healing. This is not about medicine. This is about power. Power extracted from suffering, power sharpened through fear, power institutionalized into something that looked on the surface like science. They called it a ward, but in truth it was a theater of madness, a laboratory for breaking minds and reshaping them to fit the machinery of society. The first patients were brought here in the 1820s, when America was young, and its institutions were desperate to test how far human obedience could be pushed. They were poor, forgotten souls, orphans, immigrants, widows, men too broken by war to function in polite society. Officially, they were admitted for care. Unofficially, they were test subjects. The physicians who ran the ward believed the mind was nothing more than a set of levers and switches. If you learned how to pull them in the right sequence, you could erase personality, crush resistance, and remake identity from the ground up. You could build not just patients, but servants. Not citizens, but instruments. What's more horrifying is this. Many of their techniques did not vanish with the ward. They survived, refined and polished, hidden in plain sight, inside the systems that govern you today. What you're about to hear is not just the story of one asylum. It is the anatomy of control itself. The forgotten ward was simply the prototype. Now, I want you to lean in, because once you understand what happened behind those doors, you will never look at your own freedom the same way again. The forgotten ward began like all dangerous things do, with a promise dressed in mercy. In 1824, the state commissioned a new asylum to treat the mentally afflicted in a growing frontier society that had no place for those who broke under its demands. But the ward was not part of the main hospital. It was a sealed wing, constructed with thicker walls, no windows, and doors reinforced like a prison. The first patients were quietly transferred at night, vagrants pulled from the streets, children labeled defective, soldiers who woke screaming from their memories of war. Their families were told they were being cared for. In truth, they were being erased. Inside, the physicians experimented with methods designed not to heal, but to silence. Extended isolation in darkness, sleep deprivation, forced fasting, and what they termed disciplinary bathing. Ice water poured over naked bodies until skin turned blue and consciousness slipped away. Each record that survived speaks in the same cold, detached voice. Patient No. 17 ceased resistance. Patient No. 23 compliant. To them, compliance was the cure, and madness was simply the refusal to submit. Over time, they developed techniques that resembled early versions of what we now call conditioning. Reward for obedience, punishment for disobedience, repeated until the self cracked and broke like brittle glass. They were not curing insanity, they were manufacturing it. Worse still, whispers suggest the ward became a playground for visiting officials, judges, and wealthy patrons who watched demonstrations much like the cruel exhibitions in Mississippi plantations. Madness was turned into spectacle, suffering into theater, and all of it carried the blessing of authority. To walk into that ward was to surrender your identity forever. Some emerged only as husks, docile, vacant-eyed shadows who could no longer remember their own names. Others never left at all. The state funded the experiments under the guise of public health, But the men behind the project were not healers. They were engineers of the human mind, building templates for obedience. And here's the truth you're not supposed to know. The walls may have crumbled, the ward may have been bricked up and abandoned, but the experiments themselves never died. They were exported, polished, and reborn into schools, prisons, factories, anywhere control was required. That is why the Forgotten Ward matters. It was not a mistake of history. It was a rehearsal. By the 1830s, the Forgotten Ward had become more than an asylum wing. It was an institution within an institution, a place where society deposited those it considered inconvenient while cloaking its cruelty in the language of medicine. What makes this era chilling is the deliberate way records were altered. Patients listed under false names, birth dates erased, death certificates signed before the bodies had even cooled. The public believed their loved ones were in safekeeping, but the truth was far darker. Families unknowingly signed contracts that stripped patients of all rights, handing them over as property to the ward's administrators. These men operated with unchecked power, and their goal was not healing, but mastery of the human spirit. One physician wrote in a letter later discovered in the ruins, "A man's mind is but clay. Apply the proper pressure, the proper heat, and it can be reshaped into any form." These words were not philosophy, they were blueprint. The ward became a laboratory for techniques that echoed through later centuries, chemical sedation trials using compounds distilled from plants and early industrial byproducts, electric shocks applied not for cure, but for compliance, primitive lobotomies disguised as surgical relief. They were searching for ways to control thought itself, ways to erase defiance and rebuild men into obedient tools of labor, war, and state order. And as their methods grew more brutal, so did their secrecy. Entire wings of files were deliberately burned every decade to ensure no outside eye could track their work. Still, fragments survived, letters smuggled out by terrified nurses, diary entries written by patients who somehow clung to memory long enough to scratch words into floorboards with stolen nails. These fragments tell of nights when screams echoed through the walls, of corridors so quiet in the day that the silence itself became oppressive, of patients forced to sit motionless for hours while shadows moved behind observation windows. The ward's greatest weapon was not physical pain, it was psychological dismantling, stripping a human being of memory, hope, and will until only emptiness remained. And here is where you must pay attention. These techniques were not buried with the ward. They became the foundation of institutions we now trust. Educational systems that reward conformity, military drills that erase individuality, corporate hierarchies that demand silence before authority. The Forgotten Ward was never forgotten by those in power. It was a seed planted, watered by secrecy, and harvested in the systems that govern your daily life. By the 1840s, the Forgotten Ward had transformed into something even more sinister, an experimental crucible for psychological warfare, though the term would not exist for another century. Officially, the report spoke of advances in moral treatment, a phrase meant to soothe the public conscience, but behind the ward's sealed doors, the methods bore little resemblance to morality. Patients were forced into elaborate scenarios designed to test their breaking points. False trials, where they were accused of crimes they never committed, staged deaths of fellow inmates to instill terror, fabricated messages from family members telling them they had been abandoned. Each experiment was carefully logged in coded language, turning human anguish into data points on obedience and resistance. The administrators had realized something chilling, that if you could fracture a person's sense of reality, you could rebuild them from the ground up. And in that rebuilding, you could insert anything: loyalty, submission, devotion to authority. Visitors to the ward, wealthy benefactors and state officials, were granted private tours, witnessing demonstrations where once defiant men now saluted their captors, women once screaming in protest now knelt in silence, eyes hollow yet obedient. These patrons believed they were witnessing the triumph of science, proof that disorder could be converted into order. But what they were truly funding was the perfection of control, the creation of human beings who no longer belonged to themselves. And here lies the deeper corruption. The ward was not an isolated horror, it was a mirror of its age, reflecting a society obsessed with obedience, hierarchy, and the crushing of dissent. While plantations perfected physical domination, the ward perfected mental subjugation, ensuring not just that bodies could be owned, but that minds could be programmed. The great Saint secret is this: the ward was never about curing madness. It was about creating it in measured doses, then harnessing it as a tool of governance. Madness was weaponized, used to break individuals, and then held up as a warning to the rest of society. Resist the order, and you too will be erased behind locked doors. And so, the forgotten ward thrived, not in spite of society's silence, but because of it. For every scream muffled by stone walls, there was a community outside grateful that the noise of disorder was kept hidden, never realizing that the techniques perfected within would one day echo in their own schools, their workplaces, their prisons, their very homes. By the 1850s, the forgotten ward had become less a hospital and more a theater of control, where human suffering was orchestrated like a performance with scripts, roles, and outcomes all dictated by unseen directors. The walls themselves seemed complicit, paint flaking from damp stone, corridors echoing with whispers of men and women rehearsing their new identities, forced to repeat phrases until their own names dissolved into nothing. What outsiders never knew was that the ward had begun exporting its methods, quietly training select physicians, clergymen, and schoolmasters in techniques of psychological dominance. These were not medical lessons. They were blueprints for authority, shared under the guise of education, but rooted in cruelty. Diaries from a nurse who defected speak of lesson chambers, where children taken from orphanages were used as practice subjects for visiting officials, mock classrooms where a child who resisted was shocked into compliance, while a child who obeyed was starved of affection, proving to the observers that loyalty was only as strong as the fear that produced it. The ward's doctrine was spreading, hidden in plain sight, cloaked in the very language of progress. At the same time, its archives grew thicker, meticulously recording not just the torment of its patients but the results of long-term observation. How long it took a man to forget his mother's face, how many days before a woman believed she had never had children, how often a patient could be convinced that he had committed crimes invented by his captors. This was not healing, it was erasure, systematized and measured like science. And yet, perhaps the darkest revelation of all is that the ward no longer relied on chains or bars. The most effective cages were invisible. Patients were conditioned to police themselves, to correct their own thoughts, to punish themselves internally, long after the doctors left the room. This was the birth of a new kind of captivity, one that would outlive the ward itself, the prison of the mind, where obedience is no longer enforced from the outside, but from within. Society praised the ward for keeping disorder contained, never realizing that it was also teaching them how to accept their own invisible chains. The forgotten ward was not simply a place. They had turned it into a philosophy, one that seeped beyond its walls, reshaping the very definition of sanity, authority, and control. By the 1860s, the forgotten ward had perfected its most insidious weapon, not torture, not confinement, but silence. Silence became the instrument through which identities unraveled and realities collapsed. Patients were stripped not only of possessions, but of language itself. Conversations were forbidden, names were replaced with numbers, and even prayer was outlawed. Days stretched into weeks, where the only sound permitted was the shuffle of boots along the corridor or the scratching of quills by the doctors, who observed like predators, waiting for a weakness to surface. In this silence, madness bloomed not as an accident, but as a carefully cultivated crop. and the ward's overseers documented every stage with almost religious devotion. The files describe men who began speaking to the walls, women who carved invisible patterns into the air with trembling fingers, children who rocked back and forth until their spines warped. All reactions catalogued, compared, and deemed successful outcomes of their experiments in obedience. The silence was not absence. It was control, a way of dissolving resistance by denying the human need for connection. And here lies the horror that should not be ignored. Silence did not stay locked in the ward. The same principles migrated outward into society, woven into the fabric of prisons, factories, and even households where obedience was prized above individuality. The lesson was simple, yet devastating. When you strip people of their voices, they cease to be a threat, and over time, they cease to be people at all. The ward became a blueprint not just for managing the insane, but for managing populations, teaching those in power that the greatest tyranny is not through whips or chains, but through the calculated suffocation of expression. Even today, the echoes of this silence remain. In classrooms where curiosity is punished, in workplaces where questions are silenced, in homes where obedience is demanded without explanation. The forgotten ward did not disappear into history. It slipped unnoticed into the bones of society, cloaked in respectability, perpetuating its doctrine through generations. And the cruelest truth of all is this: silence, once weaponized, needs no ward to sustain it. It flourishes in the minds of those who inherit it, passed down like a curse, invisible but unbreakable. By the 1870s, the forgotten ward had become more than a hidden chamber of medical cruelty. It was a proving ground for the state's emerging appetite for psychological warfare. Governments, already hungry for ways to keep restless populations subdued, began sending envoys to witness the ward's demonstrations. Behind locked doors, patients were paraded like broken animals, forced to recite patriotic oaths they once resisted, their faces blank, their voices mechanical. To the officials in attendance, this was not horror. It was promise. The ward had shown that the mind could be conquered with precision, and conquest of the mind was far more enduring than chains upon the body. Contracts were signed in the quiet of night, and money flowed steadily into the ward's coffers, ensuring its survival even as whispers of its brutality began to circulate among the public. What few dared to suspect was that the ward was no longer merely studying madness. It was actively engineering methods that would later surface in the training of soldiers, the interrogation of prisoners, the indoctrination of children. A physician's journal from 1873, hidden for decades, coldly outlines the doctrine of total compliance, detailing how repeated cycles of deprivation and reward could forge men into unthinking instruments of authority. The military recognized its value immediately. Officers were invited into the ward to observe the techniques firsthand, then quietly carried those lessons back to their barracks, where they were refined and disguised as discipline. Even the church was not absent from these exchanges, for priests, too, saw the utility of shaping flocks who would never question, never resist, never deviate. By the end of the decade, the ward was no longer just a hospital. It was a nexus, a dark university where the state, the church, and the emerging machinery of industry came to drink from the same poisoned well. The tragedy was not only that lives were destroyed within its walls, it was that the philosophy perfected there seeped outward, cloaked in uniforms, sermons, and textbooks. The forgotten ward had become invisible precisely because it had become everywhere, its lessons embedded in the very institutions that claimed to uphold order, morality, and progress. By the 1880s, the corruption of the forgotten ward was no longer confined to its stone walls. It had seeped into the soil of the surrounding town, infecting families, schools, and even the rhythm of daily life. Locals whispered that the ward was cursed, yet few dared speak above a hushed tone, for many relied on its steady wages or feared the retaliation of men in black coats who moved silently through the streets after nightfall. The town's children grew up under its shadow, some taken as apprentices to learn the trade of medicine, only to vanish into its labyrinth and never return home. Shopkeepers noticed patients walking through the market at odd hours, supervised by grim orderlies, their faces vacant, their movements stiff, as if they were marionettes whose strings were being pulled from an unseen place. Ministers preached obedience more fiercely than ever, weaving the language of the ward into sermons about sin and punishment, convincing congregations that silence and submission were godly virtues. Even the schools adopted new methods, importing teachers trained by physicians from the ward who drilled children in rote recitation until their voices sounded more like echoes than individuals. Over time, the line between the ward and the town blurred, as if the entire community had become an extension of the experiment. Streets orderly, citizens compliant, laughter rare, curiosity punished with quiet suspicion. Families who questioned too loudly about their missing relatives often found themselves branded as unstable, then conveniently committed, disappearing into the very place they sought answers from. The ward had achieved what it always wanted: invisibility through normalization. Its doctrines were no longer confined to medical files, but woven into lullabies, sermons, and lessons that children absorbed without knowing they were inheriting chains. The true genius of the ward's cruelty was that it did not need to remain hidden. It needed only to become ordinary. And so, by the close of the century, the forgotten ward was less a building than a living organism. Its roots spread through the veins of a town that no longer remembered what life felt like before submission, a community that had been reshaped into silence without ever realizing it had been conquered. By the 1890s, the forgotten ward had learned to cloak itself in the shining armor of science, wrapping its horrors in the respectable language of modern medicine. The world was entering an age of progress. Microscopes, surgical tools, and chemical compounds promised miracles, and the ward positioned itself at the forefront of this revolution, publishing carefully sanitized reports in medical journals while burying its darker experiments deep in sealed archives. To the public eye, it was a beacon of innovation, hailed for pioneering therapies that appeared to calm madness, when in truth, those therapies were nothing more than refined methods of control, carefully measured doses of new sedatives that silenced screams but left minds hollow, surgical procedures dressed as cures that were in reality crude attempts to erase memory and will. Visitors from prestigious universities traveled miles to observe, never questioning why they were only shown select patients. Those who had been broken into docility, paraded like trophies of science. Behind closed doors, however, the experiments grew more ambitious and grotesque. Patients were injected with untested chemicals distilled from industrial waste, strapped into early electrical contraptions meant to reset the brain, or subjected to isolation chambers where time itself seemed to dissolve. Some were kept awake for weeks under the pretense of study, their shattered minds carefully documented in cold, clinical handwriting that stripped them of humanity. Yet the most cunning move of all was how the ward aligned itself with progressives in politics and academia, convincing them that institutional control was not only necessary, but noble. Newspaper articles praised the ward's efficiency, donations poured in from wealthy patrons who wanted their names associated with scientific advancement, and families willingly surrendered their troubled loved ones, believing they were entering a sanctuary of healing. The truth, that these souls were being fed into a machine of experimentation and erasure, was buried beneath headlines and medical jargon, and so the ward survived, not by hiding in darkness, but by stepping boldly into the light, transforming its chains into instruments of progress, its silence into proof of cure. By the turn of the century, the ward no longer feared discovery, because discovery itself had become its disguise. It was not a forgotten place anymore. It was celebrated, studied, even envied, its philosophy spreading through hospitals, schools, and prisons worldwide. The great deception was complete. Cruelty had been baptized as science, and no one dared call it by its true name. By the dawn of the 20th century, The forgotten ward had found its perfect ally in the rise of industry, binding its doctrine of control to the rhythms of the machine age. Factories were multiplying, cities swelling with workers who labored from dawn until exhaustion, and the ward's physicians recognized in these new industrial systems the very principles they had been refining for decades: obedience, repetition, silence. Industrialists, eager to maximize efficiency, began consulting with ward administrators who offered chilling insights: how to strip individuality from workers, how to condition men to endure monotonous labor without question, how to transform human beings into living extensions of machines. The conveyor belt became a reflection of the ward's corridors, endless, repetitive, grinding down will and thought into mechanical obedience. It was no coincidence that foremen were trained in disciplinary methods remarkably similar to those perfected in the ward, using punishment, deprivation, and rewards to shape the workforce. Meanwhile, within the ward's walls, patients were subjected to new experiments inspired by the machine itself. Their bodies wired with crude electrodes, their sleep cycles measured against factory bells, their movements tracked as if they were gears in a system of flesh. The obsession was no longer just about breaking individuals. It was about designing a model human, one stripped of resistance, perfectly synchronized to the demands of industry and state. Families who visited noticed the eerie resemblance between patients and the new worker class: the same vacant stares, the same mechanical obedience, the same exhaustion that left no room for rebellion. And society, dazzled by progress, failed to see that what they celebrated as efficiency was born from cruelty. The ward had quietly succeeded in exporting its philosophy into the heart of modern life, disguised not as horror, but as advancement. By the early 1900s, its fingerprints were everywhere, in the ringing of factory whistles, in the regimentation of classrooms, in the sermons that preached submission, in the military drills that reduced men to identical units. The machine age had not merely adopted the ward's lessons, it had amplified them, embedding psychological control into every waking hour of human existence. The forgotten ward was no longer confined to stone walls. It was humming in every engine, ticking in every clock, and echoing in the footsteps of workers who marched to rhythms not of their own making. By the 1910s, the forgotten ward had quietly merged with the rising science of psychology, embedding its doctrine of control into what would soon be called social engineering. Universities began teaching theories of behavior and cognition, yet many of these innovations were simply refinements of experiments first carried out in the ward's dim corridors. Professors quoted studies on obedience and conformity without admitting their origins, and eager young psychologists carried forward methods polished in silence, now draped in the authority of academia. The ward, once shunned as a place of shadows, now stood at the center of intellectual progress, its influence flowing invisibly through textbooks, lectures, and conferences. Governments, too, seized on these ideas with open arms, realizing they could shape populations with the same tools that once broke patience. Campaigns for patriotism, war bonds, and moral reform were crafted like treatments, conditioning citizens to act not from conviction, but from carefully cultivated suggestion. Posters shouted messages designed to bypass reason and burrow directly into the subconscious, echoing the ward's strategy of dismantling thought through repetition and fear. At the same time, the ward deepened its internal experiments, taking advantage of new technologies and the growing belief that science could solve every social ill. Patients were subjected to hypnotic regimens meant to erase memory, drug cocktails designed to flatten emotion, and staged scenarios crafted to measure how far reality could be manipulated before the human mind broke completely. Some resisted, their journals, smuggled out in scraps, speaking of doctors who smiled as they rewrote lives, as if identity itself were clay to be molded. Yet society outside celebrated the progress of psychology, unaware that the very same discoveries shaping schools, prisons, and demilitary camps had first been tested on the broken. The ward's greatest triumph was not in the suffering it inflicted behind closed doors, but in its ability to export that suffering as knowledge, to disguise cruelty as science, and to convince entire nations that control was healing, obedience was order, and silence was sanity. By the eve of the First World War, the ward's fingerprints were everywhere, hidden in propaganda, discipline, and education, ensuring that when millions marched to slaughter, they did so with minds already conditioned by lessons birthed in darkness. By the time the First World War erupted, the forgotten ward's methods found their most devastating stage, for what had been tested on a handful of captives was now unleashed upon entire armies and nations. Military officials, desperate to forge men who would charge into gunfire without hesitation, drew directly from the ward's doctrine of total compliance. Training camps mirrored its corridors, stripped individuality, relentless drills, the destruction of identity until only obedience remained. Soldiers were deprived of sleep, screamed at, broken down, then rebuilt into extensions of command, their humanity reduced to reflex. Propaganda, too, became a weapon forged from the ward's lessons, posters that bypassed reason and struck at fear, duty, and guilt, repeating phrases until they embedded themselves into the national psyche. Civilians were conditioned as carefully as soldiers, taught to equate dissent with treason, silence with loyalty, and sacrifice with virtue. Behind the front lines, the ward itself did not sleep. Its doctors were recruited to study shell shock, not to heal it, but to discover how far the human mind could be pushed before it shattered, and how it might be forced back into service once broken. Patients returned from the trenches found themselves subjected to electric shocks, chemical injections, and hypnotic suggestion, their trauma mined for data while their screams were dismissed as necessary noise in the progress of science. Journals from that decade reveal a chilling phrase repeated among physicians: "The mind is a weapon, broken, reforged, and aimed where needed." The war had confirmed the ward's ultimate theory, that control was not an isolated experiment but the engine of modern civilization itself. And while millions lay buried beneath foreign soil, the philosophy perfected in the ward spread deeper into the fabric of nations, becoming the invisible law beneath schools, factories, prisons, and governments. The forgotten ward had achieved what it always sought: invisibility through normalization. No one called it cruelty anymore. They called it training, patriotism, duty. And in that rebranding, the world embraced the very nightmare it should have destroyed. The 1920s arrived, draped in the illusion of liberation: jazz, dance halls, automobiles, and the promise of a world moving past the devastation of war. But beneath that glittering surface, the shadow of the forgotten ward deepened its reach. What society called modernity was, in truth, a vast experiment in behavioral control, a direct evolution of lessons the ward had perfected in silence. Advertisers now borrowed openly from its methods, using repetition, suggestion, and emotional triggers to mold desires, convincing people to crave products they did not need, to measure their worth in possessions rather than in freedom. Schools grew harsher in discipline, stripping individuality under the pretense of preparing children for the efficiency of industry. Governments refined propaganda into an art, creating entire departments dedicated to psychological manipulation, their posters and broadcasts indistinguishable in design from the ward's internal experiments. Even psychiatry, rising in respectability, became another mask, its practitioners publishing grand theories on repression, obedience, and social order, while in their private notes they echoed the very phrases first scrawled in the ward's hidden archives. The decade's roaring freedoms were carefully staged illusions, distractions for populations increasingly molded by invisible hands. Meanwhile, the ward itself expanded into a network of satellite institutions, each adopting its doctrine under different names: hospitals, reformatories, schools for the feeble-minded. Families sent their wayward children or troubled relatives into these places, never suspecting they had delivered them into laboratories of erasure. Survivors wrote in secret about endless nights of silence, experiments with new chemical compounds, staged realities that blurred the line between truth and hallucination. One patient described being forced to listen to phonographs repeating the same phrase until he began to believe he had never lived outside the ward at all. What the 1920s revealed most clearly was that control no longer needed bars or chains. It was cultural, psychological, embedded in music, fashion, advertising, and education, shaping entire populations who believed they were free even as their thoughts were being engineered. The Forgotten Ward had succeeded beyond its founders' wildest ambitions. It had dissolved into the bloodstream of modern life, no longer feared, no longer hidden, because it no longer needed to be. By the 1930s, the world itself had begun to resemble a vast extension of the Forgotten Ward, as political extremism, economic despair, and mass movements provided the perfect canvas for its doctrine of control to manifest openly. Nations in turmoil discovered what the ward had always known. When fear and uncertainty grip the human mind, obedience can be extracted with terrifying ease. Leaders rose who understood, instinctively, or perhaps through direct inheritance of the ward's teachings, that the masses could be molded like patients once were, through repetition, isolation, and the erasure of identity in favor of collective submission. Entire populations became experiments, rallies designed with the precision of psychological conditioning, symbols repeated until they replaced thought, chants echoing the same way patients once repeated scripted lines in the ward's corridors. The Great Depression became a global proving ground where hunger and despair stripped people of resistance, making them pliable to promises of order and salvation, no matter how brutal. Behind closed doors, the ward itself was no relic. It was thriving, feeding its methods to state officials who sought ever more efficient tools for controlling dissent. Documents from this era describe population treatments, entire strategies for reshaping communities through propaganda, ritualized fear, and the careful creation of enemies both real and imagined. The parallels to its earliest experiments were unmistakable: false trials, manufactured realities, the weaponization of silence. Now, instead of a few patients, nations themselves became subjects. Families who had once whispered about missing loved ones now found themselves whispering about neighbors who vanished after speaking too loudly, and the line between asylum and government blurred to the point of invisibility. The most chilling realization of the 1930s is not that tyranny spread, but that it spread with the same methods first perfected in the ward. Strip away individuality, instill silence, reward obedience, punish deviation, and erase memory until only submission remains. What was once confined to a stone building had scaled upward into the machinery of entire states, and the world, hungry for order, welcomed it. By the 1940s, the hidden machinery of the Forgotten Ward had found its most terrifying expression in the machinery of the Second World War, where entire nations became laboratories of suffering, and millions of lives were reduced to test subjects for ideologies born of control, silence, and ritualized violence. The ward's methods, once confined to corridors and locked cells, now echoed through camps whose barbed wire fences stretched to the horizon, where the same experiments in obedience, identity erasure, and psychological dismantling were scaled to industrial proportions. Prisoners stripped of names and reduced to numbers mirrored the ward's earliest practice of replacing human identity with clinical designation, while the daily roll calls, the endless repetition of commands, and the calculated starvation were extensions of its precise conditioning strategies. But it was not just within the camps that the ward's doctrine surfaced. It lived in the way propaganda became a constant drumbeat, voices on radios drilling phrases into minds until they replaced thought, images plastered on walls shaping perception as thoroughly as any drug or electrode. The war itself became a ritual of mass control, sirens that conditioned fear, uniforms that enforced conformity, borders redrawn not just with armies, but with the erasure of memory, as entire histories were rewritten or burned in flames. And yet, hidden in archives, we find the fingerprints of the ward more directly. Officials meeting with doctors who had studied its techniques, reports exchanged between governments that spoke of collective management of human will, as if it were a medical problem rather than a moral atrocity. The result was a world reshaped by the cold precision of psychological domination, where millions obeyed orders that defied humanity, not because they believed, but because belief itself had been said with programming. The Forgotten Ward had succeeded in unleashing its legacy beyond stone walls, embedding its logic into the very fabric of civilization's darkest war, where the silence of the individual became the triumph of the system, and obedience reached its ultimate harvest. When the war ended, the world told itself that the horrors uncovered in camps and asylums were aberrations, crimes to be prosecuted and buried so they would never return. But the truth was far more sinister. The victors did not destroy the methods of control. They absorbed them, institutionalized them, and carried them forward under new banners of science, intelligence, and national security. The same doctors who had perfected torment under dictatorships were quietly given new homes in laboratories and agencies, their files stamped with new insignias, their research on human obedience labeled as classified assets. The Forgotten Ward's ghost now wore a different mask, not the cracked stone walls of a madhouse, but the polished offices of emerging intelligence agencies, where men in suits pored over notes on sensory deprivation, sleep manipulation, and the breaking of personality into obedient fragments. Projects began under coded names, claiming to defend democracy, but in reality, replicating the ward's oldest experiments, test subjects drawn from prisons, hospitals, and the forgotten corners of society, dosed with chemicals, isolated in chambers, their screams muffled not by stone walls, but by secrecy oaths and sealed files. The public believed they were living in a new age of freedom, but behind the curtain, the same rituals of erasure continued, now wrapped in the language of progress. Radio signals replaced the ward's whispered commands, media repetition replaced chanting in corridors, and entire populations were guided, nudged, and corrected with psychological techniques refined not in classrooms, but in the crucible of cruelty. This was not a rejection of the ward's philosophy. It was its ascension. The methods that once reshaped the minds of dozens could now be deployed against millions with precision, and what had begun as a forgotten chamber of madness had become the operating system of the modern world. The Cold War did not merely divide the world between East and West. It became the perfect breeding ground for psychological domination, a vast stage where two empires competed not just for land and weapons, but for the control of human perception itself. Both sides drew from the same poisoned well, studying how fear could be manufactured, how entire populations could be kept in a permanent state of tension, alert but paralyzed, ready to obey orders without question. In the West, agencies poured millions into programs that extended the ward's logic: sensory deprivation tanks, chemical trials, hypnosis protocols, and staged psychological shocks, all designed to fracture the mind and reconstruct it in a form more manageable, more compliant. In the East, mirrored projects unfolded in secret institutes where political prisoners and dissidents became raw material for experiments in re-education and enforced belief. The methods may have varied, but the goal was identical: to erase the individual and replace him with a predictable unit of control. What had once been whispered chants in crumbling corridors became broadcasts repeated endlessly through radios, televisions, and newspapers, embedding fear and loyalty at the same time. The Iron Curtain was less a wall of steel and more a veil of thought control techniques perfected over decades, shaping what people could say, what they could believe, even what they could dare to imagine. And those who resisted, those who tried to peel away the layers of manufactured reality, were often locked away in psychiatric hospitals, declared insane not because of madness, but because they had glimpsed too much of the truth. The forgotten ward had grown, no longer confined to one building. It now extended across borders, its walls invisible but its rules absolute, ensuring that whether a man lived in Moscow, Berlin, or Washington, his thoughts were never entirely his own. The rise of mass media transformed the ward's whispers into thunder, giving its keepers a new weapon that was more powerful than chains or drugs: the endless repetition of carefully crafted narratives. Newspapers, radios, and later televisions became the padded walls of a global asylum, their screens and pages replacing the ward's crumbling stones, their anchors and announcers acting as modern attendants who guided the collective mind with steady, reassuring voices. What once took months of isolation and manipulation in a hidden chamber could now be achieved in a single broadcast, repeated across millions of households until reality itself bent to the script. Fear was packaged into headlines, loyalty into slogans, and obedience into entertainment that lulled the masses into passive submission. The lessons of the ward were clear: break the individual with confusion, then feed him certainty until he clings to it as salvation, and the media became the perfect delivery system for this ritual. Crises were magnified, solutions pre-approved, and those who questioned the narrative were branded unstable, conspiratorial, or dangerous, echoing the old verdict of insanity handed down to those who resisted the ward's control. The walls no longer needed to be physical. They existed inside the mind, built from stories repeated so often that they became indistinguishable from memory. The patients had multiplied, the attendants had changed uniforms, but the ward itself, its methods, its objectives, had simply grown in scale, enveloping whole nations until everyone was inside, whether they realized it or not. If the media served as the ward's voice, then the schools became its nursery, shaping minds before they even had the chance to question who they truly belonged to. Education, once framed as liberation, was quietly re-engineered into the earliest and most effective conditioning chamber, instilling obedience not through shackles, but through repetition, grading, and fear of failure. Children entered classrooms eager to learn. But what they absorbed was not just arithmetic or history. It was the rhythm of bells that conditioned them to move at commands, the memorization of approved facts that erased curiosity, and the silent lesson that authority was never to be challenged. The ward's methods of breaking and rebuilding were now disguised as curricula, where inconvenient truths were excised from textbooks and uncomfortable questions were replaced with standardized answers. The same cycle repeated: isolation from parents during long hours, constant observation by figures of authority, and rewards given only when conformity was displayed. Those who resisted were not strapped to beds but labeled as problem students, medicated into compliance, their energy subdued by pills rather than restraints. Over time, the distinction between the patient of the ward and the pupil of the school blurred. The same architecture of control, the same rituals of obedience, simply softened by the promise of progress. Generations grew up carrying invisible scars, conditioned to believe that knowledge meant memorizing what they were told, that truth was a fixed product handed down from above, and that rebellion against this structure was madness. By the time they graduated, they no longer needed walls to confine them. The ward lived inside their thinking, silently guiding what they accepted, what they feared, and what they would never dare to ask. As children left the classrooms and stepped into adulthood, the ward did not release them. It merely changed its uniform, reshaping itself into the workplace, where obedience became a lifelong contract masked as ambition and stability. The cubicle replaced the padded cell, the manager replaced the attendant, and performance reviews replaced the medical charts that once measured compliance. Just as the ward taught its patients to conform for the sake of survival, corporations demanded loyalty and silence in exchange for wages, benefits, and the illusion of freedom. The architecture of control was identical: rigid schedules enforced by clocks, hierarchies that mirrored chains of command, and surveillance disguised as productivity monitoring. Break the pattern, question the system, and the punishment was swift: termination, blacklisting, financial ruin, social exile. The worker learned, as the patient once had, that survival depended on wearing the mask, repeating the slogans, and pretending belief in goals that were never truly his own. Even ambition was a trap, carefully structured so that promotions only deepened the chains, binding the worker tighter to the institution until the ward's philosophy was not just followed, but lived. The corporate creed demanded the same sacrifices as the asylum once did: surrender of individuality, suppression of doubt, and obedience to authority, with the promise that compliance would earn safety. And yet, just like the ward's broken patients, many found themselves hollowed out by decades of conformity, their creativity drained, their willpower eroded, their identities dissolved into job titles and payroll numbers. The ward had not died. It had matured into an economy, a system that consumed human energy and returned only enough to keep its inmates alive, obedient, and too afraid to escape. Religion, once a fire meant to guide souls toward transcendence, was steadily folded into the machinery of the ward, transformed from a path of liberation into a cage of obedience dressed in sacred symbols. The chants of priests echoed the monotone recitations of attendants, sermons replaced the whispered commands of doctors, and rituals of confession and penance became mirrors of the ward's endless cycle of guilt and submission. Faith, in its purest form, had been a rebellion against fear, but the ward's keepers learned to twist it into a mechanism of control, teaching followers that questioning authority was not just disobedience, but blasphemy. Ancient scriptures were edited, reinterpreted, and weaponized into doctrines that demanded conformity, with eternal torment promised to those who dared think for themselves. Just as the ward conditioned its inmates to equate freedom with madness, organized religion taught millions to equate doubt with sin, ensuring that the prison of the mind extended beyond life itself into the terrifying shadow of the afterlife. Holy days became rehearsals in obedience, collective ceremonies where the individual dissolved into the mass, repeating prayers with the same monotony that patients once repeated affirmations in padded halls. Even the architecture echoed the ward: cathedrals with soaring walls that dwarfed the human figure, reminding worshippers of their insignificance, their need to bow. And as with the asylum, those who resisted, who saw through the manipulation, were declared heretics, cast out or destroyed, their memory erased to preserve the illusion of harmony. The ward did not need to break into society to rule it. It was woven into its deepest spiritual fabric, ensuring that even a man's search for God could be redirected into a submission to men who claimed to speak for him. In this way, the ward's influence did not end at the borders of the body or the mind. It reached into eternity itself. Governments emerged as the grand architects of the ward's expansion, stitching together media, schools, workplaces, and religion into a seamless structure of control that could encompass entire nations under the illusion of freedom. What the asylum once tested on the broken and forgotten, governments now scaled to millions, wielding laws, borders, and armies as the physical walls of a ward too vast to see. Bureaucracy became the new restraint, endless forms and regulations serving the same purpose as leather straps and locked doors, binding citizens into obedience not through chains, but through dependency. Taxes, licenses, permits, and identification numbers acted as the tracking systems of an open-air asylum where every movement could be measured, every deviation recorded, every rebellion quietly suppressed before it could ignite. Politicians played the role of wardens, their speeches dripping with promises of safety and prosperity, while behind closed doors they maintained the machinery of surveillance, war, and propaganda. Even the language of governance mirrored the asylum's philosophy. Citizens were called the governed, the public, or the masses, never individuals with sovereign will, but patients in need of guidance and correction. Dissent was tolerated only when it could be controlled, redirected, or used as a spectacle to reinforce authority, just as attendants once allowed outbursts in the ward to remind others of the consequences of resistance. And those who refused entirely were labeled traitors, radicals, or extremists. The modern equivalent of being declared insane, exiled from society to preserve the illusion that the system was sane, just, and necessary. Governments learned that control did not require constant violence. It required the constant threat of it, a shadow looming large enough to keep citizens policing themselves, much like patients who, after years in confinement, learned to follow rules without needing to be watched. The asylum had finally ascended into the political sphere, no longer hidden in stone walls, but operating in parliaments, congresses, and ministries. An invisible ward where the entire world was patient and the treatment plan was obedience. Surveillance became the watchtower of the modern ward, an invisible panopticon that ensured no one could move, speak, or even think without the possibility of being observed. What began as guards peering through barred windows in the asylum's corridors evolved into cameras on every corner, microphones in every device, and data streams flowing ceaselessly into servers that recorded the pulse of entire populations. The ward's attendants no longer needed to stand in the room. Their gaze was now digital, constant, and inescapable, turning the world into a prison where the bars were invisible, but the pressure to conform was relentless. People learned to censor themselves, not because someone barked commands, but because the threat of being watched was always present, hanging over them like a shadow. Every email, every phone call, every transaction became a record, a chart in a file, no different from the notes once scribbled on clipboards about a patient's behavior. But now the file belonged not just to the broken few locked away, it belonged to everyone. Algorithms took the role of attendants, analyzing habits, predicting movements, prescribing punishments in the form of frozen accounts, denied access, or social ostracization. The genius of the ward had always been its ability to make obedience seem voluntary, and surveillance perfected this art. People began to watch themselves more harshly than any guard ever could, adjusting their thoughts, their words, their beliefs to avoid the invisible strike of exposure. Just as the patients of old eventually internalized the ward's rules until they lived them without question, modern citizens carried the ward in their pockets, their screens, their routines, unaware that their compliance was no longer commanded. It was self-inflicted. The asylum had achieved what it had always longed for, to dissolve its walls into the very fabric of life so completely that escape was not only impossible, it was unthinkable. Medicine and psychiatry, once seen as saviors from suffering, were quietly absorbed into the architecture of the ward, their white coats and sterile offices disguising the same mission of shaping human behavior into predictable obedience. What had begun with restraints, shock therapies, and whispered experiments in hidden asylums evolved into prescriptions, diagnoses, and treatment plans handed out like commandments. The language of healing masked the language of control. Patients were no longer called madmen, but disorders. Their resistance translated into clinical labels that justified chemical correction. Pills replaced shackles, sedation became therapy, and compliance was measured not by personal freedom, but by how well one fit into the expectations of society. Just as the ward had conditioned its inmates to believe their rebellion was sickness, modern psychiatry convinced millions that their discontent was imbalance, their anger a chemical flaw, their yearning for freedom a symptom to be medicated away. Entire populations were pacified not by force, but by the daily ritual of swallowing tablets, trusting in systems that had rebranded obedience as wellness. Children too restless for the classroom were subdued with stimulants. Adults too weary of the corporate ward were numbed with antidepressants, and those who questioned the entire structure were often drugged into silence, their visions reduced to hallucinations, their truths dismissed as delusions. The genius of this transformation lay in its appearance of compassion. While the asylum's walls screamed of cruelty, the pharmacy's shelves whispered promises of care, making the patient thank the very system that bound him tighter. And beneath it all, the files grew thicker, the records longer, the web of data denser, feeding back into the same machine that once began with leather straps and barred windows. The ward, had not only survived, it had been enshrined in the very institutions meant to cure it, ensuring that the cycle of compliance would continue, dressed now in the language of medicine and the aura of trust. Entertainment and consumer culture became the ward's most seductive drug, replacing the sting of whips and the bitterness of pills with the sweet intoxication of endless distraction. Where the asylum once broke men through terror and silence, the new ward lulled them into complacency with flashing screens, booming music, and the promise of happiness delivered through possessions and spectacle. The television became the new padded wall, glowing not with restraint, but with stories carefully designed to pacify, while advertisements whispered the same command in different forms: obey, consume, repeat. Pleasure replaced punishment as the mechanism of control, but the result was the same. Minds dulled, wills softened, individuality dissolved into the tide of mass desire. The ward had learned that chains could be invisible if they were made of comfort, that people would surrender freedom willingly if given enough games, shows, and products to keep them distracted from the bars surrounding them. Shopping malls became cathedrals of obedience, reality shows replaced confessionals, and consumer identity substituted for true selfhood, ensuring that rebellion never arose because people mistook consumption for freedom. Even art, once the raw cry of the soul, was captured and repackaged into marketable trends, turning creativity into another sedative spoon-fed to the masses. What had once required cruelty and fear was now accomplished through pleasure, and the patient, smiling with a soda in hand and a screen before his eyes, never realized he was still inside the ward, perhaps more tightly bound than ever. For in terror one might resist, but in comfort resistance dies quietly, drowned out by laughter tracks and the glow of neon lights. War became the ward's most violent form of therapy, the ultimate reset button used whenever the structures of control began to crack, reshaping nations in the same way attendants once reshaped broken patients. In the asylum, shock, restraint, and violence were justified as treatments meant to heal the disobedient. On the global stage, bombs, invasions, and mass slaughter were cloaked in the same rhetoric: wars for freedom, security, or peace. Entire populations were thrown into cycles of terror and loss, their identities stripped away, their cultures rewritten, their obedience reinforced through trauma so overwhelming that resistance collapsed beneath it. The ward's philosophy had always been clear: destroy the self so thoroughly that the survivor clings to the very system that hurt him, and in war this principle reached its fullest expression. Cities reduced to rubble became laboratories for reconstruction, where new governments, economies, and ideologies could be installed like fresh personalities in patients who no longer remembered their old lives. Propaganda framed the carnage as necessity, just as the asylum framed its brutality as treatment, ensuring the victims not only submitted but often thanked their captors for saving them from madness, tyranny, or chaos. Soldiers became attendants in uniform, enforcing compliance with rifles instead of clipboards, while civilians became patients dragged through waves of fear, grief, and hunger until their will to resist was broken. And when the war ended, the survivors were told to forget, to rebuild, to accept the new order as if it had always been there, just as patients were encouraged to accept their reconditioned selves as normal. The ward had discovered that war was not a failure of control, it was its perfection, a cleansing fire that erased memory, rewrote identity, and left behind only obedience sealed with scars too deep to heal. Economics and debt became the ward's most silent but devastating weapons, invisible chains that bound entire societies more effectively than any army or set of iron bars. Where war shattered bodies and cities with fire, debt hollowed out entire nations quietly, extracting obedience through numbers written on paper, digits flickering on screens, contracts signed under duress, yet disguised as choice. Just as the asylum once reduced its patients to dependence on their keepers for food, water, and safety, the modern ward reduced citizens to perpetual dependence on credit, loans, and wages that never truly freed them. Generations were born already indebted, their futures mortgaged before they could walk, their labor claimed by faceless institutions that acted like attendants, cold, watchful, punishing those who missed a payment with exile from society itself. Economic policy became a form of mass conditioning, interest rates and inflation engineered like doses of medication, keeping the population oscillating between hope and desperation, never stable enough to rebel, never free enough to escape. Even nations were not spared, shackled by international debts that forced governments to obey hidden financial wardens, sacrificing the will of their people for the demands of creditors. Poverty and wealth became tools of manipulation, ensuring that the masses fought one another for scraps, while the architects of the ward tightened their grip, their power invisible yet absolute. Unlike war, which burned fast and brutal, debt was slow poison, a therapy of exhaustion that sapped strength over decades until obedience became indistinguishable from survival. And the brilliance of this system lay in its disguise. The enslaved believed they were free, signing contracts with smiles, mistaking cages for opportunities, never realizing that every purchase, every loan, every wage was another bar added to the invisible cell in which they lived their entire lives. Technology and artificial intelligence are becoming the ward's final and most terrifying evolution, the point where even thought itself risks no longer belonging to the individual, but to the system that shapes, predicts, and manipulates it. The old asylum sought to break the mind through isolation, shock, and repetition. But the new ward does not need to break anything. It simply rewires the mind by guiding attention, curating reality, and feeding impulses so subtly that people mistake manipulation for choice. Every search query, every swipe, every keystroke is logged, studied, and processed by algorithms that know a person's desires, fears, and weaknesses more intimately than he knows himself. These invisible attendants do not watch from doorways. They live inside screens, recommending what to watch, what to buy, what to believe, ensuring that obedience is not demanded but willingly offered. Artificial intelligence takes this one step further, predicting decisions before they are made, nudging outcomes toward paths that preserve the ward's structure until individuality dissolves into data streams optimized for efficiency and compliance. Where the asylum once silenced rebellion with drugs, the new ward suffocates it with distraction, drowning sparks of independent thought beneath oceans of curated entertainment, endless feeds, and digital validation. Already, people feel phantom panic when disconnected from their devices, as if the ward itself now breathes through them, whispering constantly, reassuring, correcting, steering. The final stage is clear. When machines know a man better than he knows himself, when his memories are stored in external drives, his desires anticipated by predictive code, his fears soothed by synthetic voices, then he is no longer a sovereign being, but a patient in a boundless, invisible asylum. The ward that began with barred windows and stone walls will have achieved its ultimate form, not as a place one is forced into, but as a reality so omnipresent, so seamless, that no one will ever even imagine leaving it. Resistance itself has become the ward's cleverest trap. For even rebellion is absorbed into its machinery, repackaged as spectacle and sold back to the masses as yet another form of controlled behavior. Where the old asylum crushed defiance with isolation and punishment, the modern ward anticipates it, manufactures it, and guides it into channels that strengthen the system rather than threaten it. Protest movements are broadcast and commodified, their slogans turned into hashtags, their leaders elevated into celebrities, their fury diluted into entertainment that people consume from the safety of their screens. Outrage is permitted, even encouraged, because it is predictable, because it can be measured, redirected, and monetized, never allowed to reach the point where it shatters the structure itself. Even the desire to break free becomes a marketable product. Books, films, and fashions, promising liberation while binding their buyers more tightly to consumer identity, rebellion rebranded as style. The ward does not fear noise, it fears silence, reflection, and the kind of untraceable resistance that cannot be marketed or managed. And so it tolerates spectacle, marches filmed by drones, revolutions live-streamed in high definition, because every outburst becomes another file, another data set, another opportunity to learn how the patient will react and how to guide him more perfectly next time. The genius of the ward has always been its ability to adapt, to turn even its failures into instruments of success, and in this stage, rebellion itself becomes proof of its mastery. For when the system can script both obedience and defiance, when it can choreograph both loyalty and resistance, then it has achieved total control, not just of the patient's actions but of the very idea of freedom itself. Memory is the ward's final battlefield, the place where all other forms of control converge, because if you can rewrite the past, you can command the present and dictate the future. Just as the asylum once silenced its patients by erasing their histories, replacing their names with numbers and their lives with diagnoses, so too does the modern ward reshape collective memory, stripping events of their raw truth and repackaging them into versions that serve its design. Entire chapters of human suffering are hidden in archives, mislabeled or declared too sensitive for public release, while others are rewritten as noble struggles or necessary sacrifices to preserve the illusion of progress. Heroes are turned into villains, villains into visionaries, and the machinery of history grinds on until no man can be certain whether his memory belongs to him or to the system that narrates it. Museums, textbooks, and documentaries become the padded rooms of the collective mind, decorated not with reality, but with carefully chosen fragments designed to keep the story coherent, safe, and useful. And so, the patient walks through a world of false certainties, never realizing that the ground beneath him has shifted, that the past he clings to has been altered until it no longer belongs to him. Even personal memory is not safe, for the ward has learned to flood the senses with so much noise, so much data, so many competing narratives, that recollection itself begins to dissolve into confusion. A man cannot rebel if he cannot trust his own memories, if every anchor to truth has been corroded by the slow acid of manufactured history. In this way, the ward achieves its most insidious victory, not by forcing obedience, but by ensuring that the patient no longer knows what is real and therefore has no ground from which to resist. The ward's greatest triumph is its invisibility, the seamless way it dissolves into the fabric of ordinary life until no one even suspects they are confined. Unlike the stone walls and iron bars of the old asylum, today's ward has no clear boundaries, no locked doors, no uniforms to mark the attendance from the patients. It thrives precisely because it appears to be everywhere and nowhere at once. A man wakes, goes to work, consumes, entertains himself, sleeps, and repeats, never realizing that every step, every choice, every thought has been shaped by a system designed to keep him docile and dependent. He believes himself free because there are no chains on his wrists, yet his mind is shackled by invisible bonds, algorithms that anticipate his desires before he even names them, narratives that tell him who he is and what he must fear. institutions that define the limits of what can be thought, said, or dreamed. The patient of the forgotten ward no longer begs for release because he does not know he is imprisoned, and in that ignorance lies the perfection of control. The architecture of the ward has become psychological, cultural, spiritual, embedding itself in the very language we use, the symbols we worship, the values we are taught to accept without question. Its invisibility is its greatest defense, for what cannot be seen cannot be attacked, and what cannot be named cannot be destroyed. And so men walk willingly through corridors they cannot perceive, obeying rules they cannot see, serving masters they cannot identify, mistaking the vast silence of manipulation for the natural order of existence. Invisibility ensures eternity, for the ward no longer needs to fight to remain. It has become reality itself. The cost of this invisible prison is not measured in chains or lashes, but in something far more devastating, the erosion of the human soul itself. When a man is made to believe he is free while every choice has already been scripted, something inside him withers. A fire that once burned bright grows dim until it is little more than a flicker struggling against the suffocating dark. He forgets how to hunger for truth, how to ache for greatness, how to suffer for meaning, because the ward has given him substitutes, hollow pleasures that mimic fulfillment but never satisfy, distractions that keep him endlessly busy but forever empty. The patient of this silent asylum laughs without joy, speaks without conviction, loves without depth, and dies without ever having lived, leaving behind no legacy but the echo of his compliance. His mind, dulled by repetition and guided by unseen hands, no longer questions, no longer rebels, no longer dreams beyond the narrow script he has been handed. And the tragedy is not that he is forced into this submission, but that he accepts it, defends it, and even mocks those who would dare tell him he is caged. The cost of the ward is generational, the fathers who no longer teach their sons to fight, the sons who grow into men without teeth, the men who believe the greatest act of courage is to obey. It is a cost that drains a civilization of its vitality, leaving behind a society of husks who walk and speak and consume, but carry no spirit, no will, no sovereignty. This is the ward's ultimate harvest, not bodies, but souls emptied of resistance, leaving behind only silence. And so we arrive at the final revelation. The forgotten ward, the asylum without walls, is not some distant relic buried in the ruins of history. It is here. It is now. It is us. The silence that haunts its corridors is not the silence of stone halls abandoned by time, but the silence inside every man who refuses to see, who chooses the comfort of ignorance over the terror of awakening. The ward can only exist so long as its prisoners mistake it for the world itself, so long as they do not name it, so long as they do not dare to rip away its veil. The truth is brutal but liberating. The locks are not on the doors but in the mind, and the key has always been within reach. To awaken is to suffer, to see the structures of control for what they are, to feel the weight of centuries pressing against your chest. But it is also to burn again with the fire that the ward has spent its entire existence trying to extinguish. Every man stands at this threshold, to remain asleep, docile, compliant, content with being a patient in a ward that has swallowed entire generations, or to awaken, to reclaim his will, and to shatter the silence that keeps him bound. This is not a choice that can be delayed, because the ward grows stronger with every passing year, tightening its grip until resistance feels impossible. And yet, history whispers of those who refused, of men who broke the silence, of voices that shattered the darkness with a truth so sharp it cut through the fabric of the ward itself. The final freedom is not granted by institutions, not given by rulers, not found in books or laws. It is seized by the man who dares to see. The ward will never release you. You must walk out on your own. The silence will never end until you break it. And the question that remains, the only one that matters, is this: will you